Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to our panel. I'm Abby.
I'm Christa.
Christa. And we've been working on editing a volume that's coming out in February, called Queering Anarchism. And Derek's also a co-editor. And our friend Rogue, who wanted to be here but couldn't, is also a co-editor. So we wanted to give, because it's a short time frame, it's already 10 after, so we have like 45 minutes. We wanted to just give like an overview of why we wanted to put the book together, why we thought it was important, and then briefly what we wrote about, and then hopefully just have a discussion in general about other people's experiences, or if you want to talk about the chapters or anything like that. So Derek and Rogue were working on putting the book together for, I don't know, like a couple years before Christa and I came on as additional editors, because it got a little bigger than they had originally planned. So there's a bunch of different authors in it, and I have the list of them if we can go through if people are interested. But the reason I was interested in the volume is I think queer and anarchism, I think, exists a lot in people's organizing lives and on the streets and things like that. But I didn't think there was too many texts that people could hand out or read or reference, and so we thought it'd be kind of important to put these ideas that are around in a like textual form, so utilize that and respond to it and just make the whole thing a little more accessible. What interested me about it was not just like the sexuality and gender part of queer, which I think is important. I think anarchism and anarchists could often use a better analysis of sexuality and gender in general. But I also think the part that I really like about queering or queer and stuff like that is not necessarily inherently about sex and gender and sexuality. I like the idea of challenging assumptions or discovering assumptions that we've been making about all sorts of theory-based stuff or anything like that. I like the limits of identity. I like talking about that, not necessarily sexual identity, but I largely talk about that and write about that. But when I started learning about queer theory and queer organizing and queer politics in general, and how it was really good at pulling out the specific histories of sexuality and what that means and how it's been constructed, how it can be constructed differently, and problematizing identity and the limits of that. It's really easy for me to transpose that onto other things, like how we do that with anarchism, how we do that with political identity. And so that has been one of the most interesting things to me. So a lot of the chapters in the book are about sexuality and about anarchism and about gender and about different analyses or expanding analyses, new critiques, things like that. But also, I think it's not just about expanding anarchism to have some better, sexual politics or something like that. I think it's about making anarchism better in general, because I think these ideas can be used, like I said, for political identity, ideas around race, ethnicity, things like that. Just the fluidity that queer theory and queer politics are kind of rooted in is important to me. I feel like it's like a conceptual paradigm shift in many ways to think about identities differently and the limits of them, and think about how we can be sexual beings without categorizing hierarchically, or even categorizing at all, possibly. Maybe that's a stretch, but at least not ordering hierarchically sexual practices, gender practices, things like that. That's kind of the history of the book. Just wanted to add some stuff to that. That's good. Okay. And then I'll say a little bit about my chapter, and then Krista's going to say a bit about her chapter. But I'm going to keep it brief, just because I do want to be able to talk with everyone. Because I talked with a lot of you yesterday and had a lot of good ideas. So, my chapter, briefly, is... I actually forget the title of the chapter. I think it's called Police at the Borders, and I believe there's a subtitle in there somewhere. But, I didn't take notes in my chapter. Okay. My chapter, sorry. I don't do that. I wrote in my chapter about, not to be a negative Nelly or whatever, but I wrote a lot of it was critique of current practices I see in queer circles and queer politics and people writing about queer sexualities and stuff that didn't speak to me in my sexuality. And I was talking about this yesterday, and you were in the queer caucus, and a couple other people were too, when I was just kind of briefly talking about my chapter then too. But I was writing about this idea that I was reading about Nietzsche, and he was writing about ressentiment. Is anyone familiar with that setup? Okay, cool. Any ressentiment.
Okay.
And it looks like it says resentment, but French ressentiment is spelled a little differently. But like very briefly, and I'm probably butchering this in some ways, but he's writing about how like if there's something that's oppressing you, and you're like, this sucks, I really hate it, I'm going to do the opposite because this is oppressing me, so to be unoppressed, I'm going to do the opposite. But if you're doing the opposite of something, and so you're still defining yourself by that thing that was like initially oppressing you or doing something that you didn't like. So in the end, it's kind of like you're just stuck in the same circle of like, this oppressed me, so I'm going to find liberation by being the opposite or doing the opposite or thinking of myself in the opposite way or switching positions of oppressor and oppressed or something like that. And I thought about this a lot, and I thought that there's a tendency sometimes for queer politics to take that course where, in my mind, like I like queer because we're trying to get rid of like categorization of like sexual identity. I like it for a lot of other reasons, but there's one example. And I find that often, instead of doing that along the way, myself sometimes, I'm not doing that anymore right now, but and other people and other groups and other just writings seem to invert hierarchies. And anyway, so briefly, my chapter is basically about the ways that I've seen, instead of trying to get rid of hierarchies in sexualities and categorization and do sexuality like something completely different, inverting those hierarchies. And what I mean by that is instead of getting rid of like normative ways of being sexual, we've created different normative ways of being sexual that are authentically queer. Some of the ones that I've noticed, and I'm sure people have many other stories that might be different or similar to mine, is that you know the right kink language, you go to the play parties, you wear the right stuff, you want to make out with all your friends all the time. There's no way you could be in a monogamous relationship and be queer. You have to have a certain amount of gay stuff going on. There's no queer heterosexualities that you can talk about. There's not some sort of gradation within heterosexuality where some like are like possibly more oppressed than others. Things like that. Like, and I've had that happen in my personal life where my friends just kind of assumed that I wanted to make out with them. Which was flattering, but I am a really shy person. I think sexuality is really awkward, and I'm very slow at that type of stuff. And I noticed that people just assumed a lot about me, and I'm pretty sure it's because I was identifying with queer at the time. I kind of call myself queer right now, but I'd rather just not call myself anything, but if I had to, I would go with queer. But anyway, so my chapter is basically about some of the ways that I'm feeling like queer is becoming another identity rather than maintaining itself as an anti-identity, which I think is the project and is the process of queering sexuality. And like I said, you can transpose this onto other things. I wrote a piece about, there's a review of Wild Lees and Zapatistas about a critique of political identities, like I'm a Marxist, or I'm an anarchist. And I kind of tried to do that with the way we talk about sexuality. I tried to kind of queer that. Kind of worked. But that's pretty much what my chapter is about. And I think that when you maintain having these like normative standards of what it means to be authentically queer, it does a lot of disservice to what the project of liberation is to me. I think that it tokenizes, it fetishizes, it makes authentic voices out of like the most oppressed. It kind of like works on an oppression Olympics type of thing, where like you know more and you're more authentic because you list all these ways that you're like the most non-normative or something like that. I just think that we don't need that. I just think that's totally not something we want to do. We want something completely different. That's just what I wrote about. So.
So my chapter was queering our analysis of sex work, laying capitalism bare. And the reason that I wanted to write this piece specifically was because I think that the anarchist voices around sex work are not really that present. And I think that why it's important for us to look at this is because we can take our analysis and remove sort of the problems of the nuclear family. We're not super concerned about the nuclear family. We're not super concerned about sex work upsetting the productivity of a family unit. So that was really what I came in with it. And through the piece, I'm going to go through some of the points that I brought up in it, and then also some of the questions that came up for me, and some of the questions that I still have. I feel as if through a lot of really faulty research, sex workers are construed as predominantly women under 18, and while that's certainly a huge portion of the population, it's certainly not exclusively that. And I feel as if it's really unnecessary to minimize the experiences of queer folks. of men and of other gender variant folks. And there's really this desire to paint all sex workers as these victims. And I think that as anarchists, we can see that that's not actually super useful. It's not really that helpful to be like, oh, well, these are non-agents, and so let's instead like base our analysis on that. Sex work is really useful to our analysis because it shows exactly how blatantly labor alienation happens. I feel like in a lot of other forms of labor, it's really obscured. We can't really, alienation is kind of this abstract idea, but in sex work, you can see exactly how it's happening, that you're trading literally your physical time with material goods. And so I think sometimes it looks as if it is a more harsh or more oppressive form of labor alienation. But I don't really think, and I don't think that most anarchists would say that there is a hierarchy of alienation, that one form of labor alienation is inherently worse than another. And so I really came into this from an intersectional approach, and that, of course, people are experiencing this industry through a bevy of different oppressive forces of patriarchy and heterosexism, and economic and capitalistic oppression. But that those experiences of actually being a sex worker in and of itself, of that form of labor alienation, might not be worse, and probably isn't. Because I think that what ends up happening is that our criticisms of sex work can lend to other oppressive institutions like the church and the state. Because the state is actually really threatened by sex work. The idea that the only place that you can get sex is in your nuclear family, or the sexual reproduction, whether that be biological, the actual reproduction of sexual desire is in the family. And I think what is really unique about sex work is that while certainly most sex workers don't necessarily see their labor as part of their identity, people ascribe a sexual identity based on that labor. We don't necessarily ascribe a sexual identity to a construction worker or to a librarian. I mean, unless it's in a fetishistic kind of way, which certainly happens. But like that, we assume that someone is a sex worker because something bad happened to them. They did something bad, and that is inherently linked to the labor that they do, which I don't think is super useful and definitely not accurate. But I think that's really interesting, that how sort of gender identities and sexual identities are created through sex work. We assume that sex workers chose they were either forced or they chose to do sex work. Of course, within capitalism, choice is this very limited idea. We have this perception that we're actually choosing what we're doing. We're actually deciding to be this occupation. And for some reason, with sex workers, it's considered an invalid choice, or that it was a forced choice, and that we don't have necessarily the understanding that it was a choice from a very limited number of options, because we're within capitalism. Sorry, I'm really nervous. It's really quickly. So one of the questions that came up for me is, how does sex work actually interfere within the capitalist structure? And I would argue that it interferes by upsetting the nuclear family. And one of my favorite writers, Silvia Federici, writes a lot about that and brings up some really interesting points. And then in what ways does sex work actually uphold these structures? And I think, from my perspective, a lot of that has to do with the intersections of patriarchy and heterosexism. And so something that I talk a lot about in my piece is this idea of like sacred sexuality, that we have this perception that our sexuality cannot be commodified, or it shouldn't be. And I certainly would agree with that. But not necessarily the same analysis about our other forms of labor. And that for some reason this is something very special. And so the big question that came up for me, and that I keep asking people to argue with me about, is what is so special about sexuality? What is so innate about that? That makes it this kind of thing that makes us have this gut reaction against the commodification or the laborization of it. So I would love to talk about that today. And then, so I really wanted to take the piece and have a fair amount of analysis in it, but also like make it really relevant to activists in our daily work. Because I think that the impetus to organize with sex workers is not as strong as I would like to see it. I think that we do need to organize with sex workers as anarchists, because there's a lot that we can learn from them, and there's a lot of really amazing sex worker organizing that could learn a lot from anarchists. There's certainly a lot of overlap in that. And so some of the points I brought up is just to respect sex workers, whether or not they're really positive on the industry or really negative on it. sort of what Abby was talking about as far as like the inverting of normalcy and identities. Like, I also think it's really problematic to be like, sex work is going to save the world and this is so awesome. Like, I'm such a gender variant queer person because I'm a sex worker. Like, that's also incredibly problematic, and it is unfortunately a dominant strain in the debate right now. And then the big question that I certainly haven't answered and I didn't really deal with in the piece was, what, if any, form would sex work take in a full communistic society, or society in which we move beyond? This is an inside joke, so. But in an anarchist communist society, is there any place for sex work? There certainly is going to be a need for, garment labor. There's certainly going to be a need for all sorts of manual labor. And so is there any room for sex work in that? And what would it look like? I certainly don't know. This joke that I was telling to myself last night is full communism, full sexual expression and fulfillment. If not, then is sex work still relevant? Will it continue to be this thing that we're trying to get rid of? So yeah, that's it. Thanks.